The arterial blood gas is the unfortunate nemesis of so many medical students. Nonetheless, it is an important concept to understand, particularly in the hospital setting. The goal of this short video is to demystify the ABG and give you a simplified approach on how to analyze the ABG in the clinical setting. First, we must start by memorizing a few normal values: pH 7.35 to 7.45, PaCO2 35 to 45, and bicarb 22 to 26. That's not a whole lot to memorize, but we'll make it even easier. We know that pH generally starts with 7 unless you have a really acidotic patient, so therefore it's 35 to 45, the same as PaCO2, which is also 35 to 45. So the only other number that we have to remember is bicarb, which is 22 to 26. Next, we have to remember that PaCO2 relates to the respiratory input into the equation. We also have to remember that bicarb is the metabolic input into the equation. We also have to remember that bicarb is our base and PaCO2 is our acid. This may seem very basic, but bicarb starts with B, and so does the word base, whereas PaCO2 has an A in it, just like the word acid. So, if we have a PaCO2 less than 35, we have a respiratory contribution to an alkalotic state. If we have a PaCO2 greater than 45, we have a respiratory contribution to an acidosis. Conversely, if we have a bicarb less than 22, we have a metabolic contribution to an acidosis, and if we have one greater than 26, we have a metabolic contribution to an alkalosis. Now we can set up a grid and plug in all of our values. Then we look for the column that has all the spaces filled in. This tells us the state of our patient. Let's do an example to kind of bring this home. Let's say that we draw an ABG on this patient with a pH of 7.21, PaCO2 of 54, and a bicarb of 26. The pH is less than 7.35, so we put the pH in the acid column. At 54, the PaCO2 is greater than 45 and therefore represents an acidic value and gets placed in the acid column. At 26, the bicarb is in that normal range of 22 to 26, so it goes in the normal column. All the spaces in the acid column are filled up, so we know we have an acidosis. PaCO2 is also in the acid column, so we know we have a respiratory acidosis because it's the respiratory value. Bicarb is in the normal column, so that tells us that we don't have any metabolic compensation, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. In this example, pH is 7.21, so it's acidotic and goes in the acid column. PaCO2 is normal at 35, and so it goes in the normal column. Bicarb is 18, which is in the acid range, so it goes in the acid column. So in this example, pH and bicarb are both in the acid column, and PaCO2 is in the normal column. Because bicarb represents the metabolic value, we have a metabolic acidosis. Now let's talk briefly about compensation. Compensation is like a short person with a big truck. I can make this comparison because I'm a short guy with a big truck. The big truck compensates for the short person's short stature. Let's use DKA as an example. They would have a metabolic acidosis because of their ketoacidosis, meaning their bicarb is low. In compensation, they would have an increased respiratory rate as they try and blow off CO2. Remember that CO2 is the acidic component. The goal is to try and bring the pH back to a normal state. Here's an example of what that would look like. The pH is low because it's 7.33, so we put it in the acid column. The PaCO2 is also low, it's less than 35, so we put it in the base column. The bicarb is 18, which means it's got an acidic value, so we place it in the acid column. This is what an incomplete respiratory compensated metabolic acidosis would look like. If everything lines up in a row instead of a column, we have complete compensation. Take, for instance, an aspirin overdose. Aspirin creates metabolic acidosis, but it also increases respiratory drive. So you may have a normal pH with an abnormal PaCO2 and an abnormal bicarb. In this instance, in this example, we have complete respiratory compensation for a metabolic acidosis. And that completes my short video on a simplified approach to analyzing ABGs. I hope that you found this information useful, and it's been my pleasure bringing you this educational material.